Since the beginning of time, a mark of blood has been imprinted on the history of humanity. Cain, the firstborn, was the first to shed the blood of a brother, the first to be consumed by wrath. Envy burned in his chest, leading him to commit the act that would forever transform his life and the destiny of an entire generation. Get ready to discover the beginning of a tragic journey where envy and anger gave rise to humanity's first crime. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Cain was the first son, first to see the light outside the garden where his parents, Adam and Eve, had walked with God in perfect days. Imagine the weight of this. He, the firstborn, carried a legacy marked by disobedience and the promise of hard work. Cain grew up listening to stories of Eden, where everything was easy, everything was beautiful, and communion with God was as natural as breathing. But outside, under the punishing sun, he learned to cultivate the land. Since I was little, I felt the harshness of the work in my hands, the smell of the earth mixed with sweat. Cain dug, planted and harvested, as if he wanted to extract from the soil the same perfection that his parents had lost. With each harvest, something inside him seemed to scream, an incessant search for approval, for a connection he wasn't sure how to find. Then came the birth of Abel, his younger brother, the second son. Abel, unlike Cain, found his way among the flocks. While the eldest took care of the land, Abel took care of the sheep, moving with a lightness that Cain never had. And although they grew up side by side, there was a difference in each one's eyes, an invisible distance between them. This coexistence, over time, brought to light a desire that Cain could not understand. Abel grew up at a different pace. Where Cain had the strength of his hoe-marked hands and his face hardened by the sun, Abel was calm, like the waters of a river in a silent morning. With the herds, he seemed to communicate in an almost magical way. He moved among the sheep as if they were part of him, and they followed him confidently wherever he went. Cain watched his brother with a mixture of curiosity and a hint of discomfort. There was something about Abel, something he didn't know whether to admire or envy, a piece that made him seem closer to what he imagined to be the perfection of Eden. Cain began to feel this difference in a subtle way, like a slight thorn in his heart. It was as if destiny itself had distributed different paths for each one. He, the eldest, carried the responsibility of plowing the soil, of bringing food for everyone from the land. But at the same time, he seemed to be seen as an obligation, while Abel, the shepherd, represented a kind of purity. And it didn't take long for the moment for both to present their offerings to God. Cain, from the land he cultivated so much, prepared his share carefully, seeking the recognition he desired. Abel, in turn, chose the best of his sheep, offering what he had most precious. At that moment, Cain felt the expectation rising within him, a desire to be seen, to be accepted. When the moment arrived, Cain was sure that his offer would be welcomed. He looked at the fruits of the earth, the same ones he planted with so much effort, and felt silent pride. Everything there was the work of his hands, the sweat shed, the calluses that mark his skin. Every detail reflected his commitment. He placed his offering before God with an anxious heart, almost being able to imagine the look of approval he so desired. But when he looked up to look for an answer, he saw something that disconcerted him. God accepted Abel's offering with a look of approval, like a father who recognizes the value of a child's gift. There was a glow of divine satisfaction that surrounded Abel and his offering, something that was clear to everyone there. And while Cain waited for the same, he felt an emptiness. His offer was left aside, ignored. A heavy silence fell over him, and his heart, once so full of expectation, began to fill with something else. A shadow which he could not understand, but which was bitter like a poison. Cain looked away and saw Abel, so calm, so carefree, as if he hadn't even sought the recognition he so desired. At that moment, a spark ignited something deeper in Cain, a mixture of frustration and injustice that he had never experienced. It was as if a beast, hidden until then, awakened inside him, and, without understanding why, he felt that this feeling would not be easily erased. That spark inside Cain grew, feeding on what he couldn't control. Every time he looked at Abel, he saw not just his brother, but a kind of mirror that reflected everything he wasn't, everything he thought he needed to be. Abel, always so serene, seemed to carry a lightness that Cain didn't understand, and this peace bothered him. It was as if, by being rejected, Cain had lost something he didn't even know he had. And now, as he observed God's favor on Abel, resentment took shape in his chest, like a thorn that was buried deeper and deeper. This feeling began to color everything around him. Working the land, once a silent duty, now seemed like a punishment. With each blow of the hoe, he felt the weight of his frustration and the bitter taste of envy. It was a new thing for him, this jealousy that grew like a weed in his heart. Cain tried to ignore him, but the vision of Abel, so at peace, so weightless, haunted him. It was as if, with every look he cast at his brother, the feeling grew stronger, turning into a wave that threatened to drown him. God realized what was going on in Cain's heart, and in an attempt to warn him, did something that few could expect. He spoke to Cain. He said sin was at the door, like a hungry animal waiting to attack. It was a clear warning. Cain needed to dominate that feeling before it dominated him. But these words, instead of appeasing his spirit, did something even worse. Cain felt as if there was a weight of judgment in the divine voice, as if he was being seen not as a son, but as a problem to be solved. The anger inside him was growing, and he didn't know where it could take him anymore. God's words kept echoing in Cain's mind, like a distant drum, a constant beat that he couldn't ignore. Sin is at the door. It's up to you to master it. The sentence repeated itself, taking shape in his mind, as if the earth itself whispered the warning. But instead of bringing him calm, those words increased his uneasiness. It was as if the Creator himself doubted him, as if he already expected the worst. With each passing day, Cain felt more deeply the difference between him and his brother. Abel did not carry the weight of a charge with him. He didn't seem to fight against himself or desperately seek God's approval. And this simplicity in Abel, this serenity, was like a light that burned Cain's eyes. He began to avoid his brother, but Abel's presence, even from a distance, was like a constant reminder of what he himself could not achieve. The wound in Cain's heart grew, a dark hole that seemed to suck in everything around him. Then, one afternoon, something in his chest tightened like never before. He felt that he could no longer bear that anguish alone, as if God's words had lit a flame that burned and consumed everything within him. Cain called Abel to accompany him to the field. It was a simple invitation, almost casual, like any conversation between brothers. Abel, with his carefree kindness, accepted without hesitation, following his brother along the way. As they walked through the field, Cain's heart beat heavy, each step a decision, each breath a conflict. He looked at his brother and felt the turmoil inside him increase. It wasn't just jealousy. It was a mixture of pain, resentment, and something which he could not describe, like an approaching storm, ready to break. The silence in the field was almost palpable. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft sound of Cain and Abel's footsteps broke the stillness. But even these sounds seemed distant, muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Cain walked ahead, eyes fixed in front of him, but his mind was a whirlwind. The weight in his chest turned into a dull fury, growing in a spiral without direction, without control. He felt Abel's calm gaze, that gaze that had always been a mirror of everything he himself was not. And Abel's tranquility made his anger pulse even stronger. Then, as if taken by a force greater than himself, Cain stopped. He turned to Abel, and the look he gave his brother was charged, like a storm about to break. Abel looked at him with surprise, maybe even a little concern, but without fear. That serene look was the last spark Cain needed. On impulse, as if all the accumulated resentment turned into fire, he advanced on his brother. It was all so fast, and yet each moment seemed to drag on in a slow, painful movement. Cain's hands, which had previously worked the land with dedication, were now firmly on Abel, delivering blows that echoed across the field. In an instant of blind fury, Abel's blood stained the ground, and Cain felt the heat of that tragic moment as if it were a mark that would never leave his skin. When everything fell silent, Abel's body was lifeless on the floor. Cain remained motionless, breathing heavily, as if he only now realized what he had done. The field, silent witness to that dark act, seemed to absorb Abel's blood, and the earth, once his ally, now died with the consequences of his wrath. Cain took a step back, feeling a deep emptiness, an abyss that he himself had created. And he knew at that moment that nothing would be the same as before. Cain was there, standing still, with his body heavy and his gaze lost in the blood that still stained his hands. The field, once so familiar, now seemed like a strange, hostile place. It was then that a voice deep and unmistakable called him. "Cain, where is your brother Abel?" Cain's heart skipped a beat and he felt a chill run down his spine. The question hung in the air like an invisible accusation, each word carrying the weight of what he had done. He took a deep breath and, almost without thinking, replied with a coldness that surprised him, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Those words fell from his lips emotionlessly, as if his own guilt was hiding behind indifference. But he knew, deep down, that God saw beyond words. God's question was not just about Abel's body, it was about Cain's soul, about what he had let hate do to him. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy emptiness where every beat of his heart seemed to scream the truth he tried to deny. Cain felt small, defenseless under God's invisible gaze, as if every secret was now exposed. Then God spoke again, and his words sounded like inevitable judgment. God said that Abel's blood cried out from the earth, asking for justice. And Cain, who had so often depended on the earth for his sustenance, now saw it rebelling against him. God announced to him that, from that day on, he would be a fugitive, condemned to wander the world without peace, as the land would no longer bear fruit for him. God's words fell upon Cain like a sentence he could never escape. "Cursed will you be on the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood," God had said, and each syllable weighed like a stone. Cain knew what this meant. The soil, which had previously offered him the fruits of his labor, would now refuse to produce anything for him. He would no longer have roots. He would no longer know rest. The earth, his only refuge until then, would become his enemy. Cain felt despair rising within him. His face marked with anguish, he pleaded, "My punishment is too great to bear. Whoever finds me will kill me." He found himself alone, exposed without protection, condemned to wander aimlessly, like a ghost in a world that no longer welcomed him. The idea of eternal exile was a torment he could not bear. Every step from that moment on would be that of a fugitive, someone who carries with him the mark of an irreversible error. But in an unexpected gesture, God responded in a way that Cain could never imagine. He placed a sign upon Cain, an invisible symbol that would protect him. It was a mark of mercy in the midst of punishment, an incomprehensible paradox. The first murderer in history was now also the first man to receive special protection from God. Anyone who dared to harm him would receive multiplied revenge. Cain wasn't sure what to feel about this. There was a sense of relief, but also shame and confusion. He, the man who had taken a life, now had his own life preserved, even if he had to walk a path of no return, far from everything he had known. He knew his existence would be marked by emptiness, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. With the sign upon him, he walked away, heading into the unknown, leaving behind everything he once called home. With uncertain steps and a heavy heart, Cain wandered into the unknown, feeling like a shadow among men. God's mark on him was an enigma. On the one hand, he knew his life was protected. No one would dare take away from him what God had already sentenced him to keep. On the other hand, this same brand made him stand out, reminding everyone and himself of what he had done. It was a constant exile, a life in which every face he encountered carried a mixture of fear and contempt. He became a wanderer, a homeless wanderer, but his restlessness led him to something even more unexpected. On his journey, he arrived at an inhospitable place, an empty and nameless land, where silence was his only companion. There, in the middle of nowhere, Cain had a bold idea. He would build something, a city, a place where he could try to erase or at least alleviate the loneliness that accompanied him. It was then that he began to build the first structures, perhaps driven by a vague hope that one day that mark on his soul might disappear, or at least blend into the life that was being born around him. This impulse to create, to leave something in the world, was a cry from those who wanted in some way to belong again, even if just a little. And so, the first city was born, the result of guilty hands and a heart that still yearned for redemption, even though the pain of everything it had lost continued to haunt every step of its path. The city that Cain began to build was built in an arid place, in the midst of a silence that seemed to constantly whisper the weight of its history. Every stone, every piece of wood he lifted, seemed to carry a little of his desire to find some peace, a refuge that exile and guilt had stolen from him. He called it Enoch, a name given in honor of his son, as if by naming that place he could create a new beginning for his lineage, something different from his own marked destiny. The city grew, slow and silent, attracting other wanderers, those who also carried burdens and stories they preferred to leave behind. Over time, Enoch began to take shape, a small civilization born of one man's attempt to remake what he had broken. Each new inhabitant was a promise that something could be built, something that could last, even if he knew deep down that that city would never erase his guilt or memories. But as he watched the place prosper, Cain couldn't help the feeling of bitter irony that welled up inside him. He, the first assassin, was now the founder of the first city. How could someone marked by destruction now be responsible for creating a community? It was as if life itself was mocking his attempt at redemption. But even with this anguish in his chest, Cain dedicated himself to lifting Enoch day after day, as if each brick were a silent prayer. And there, as he built and watched the generations that came after him grow, Cain found himself surrounded by a paradox. There were families, children, work, and the beginning of their own culture. His mark still kept him at a distance, but Abel's blood, which cried out from the ground, seemed to mix now with the sound of the footsteps and voices of the people in Enoch. Cain was the eternal stranger, the man whose mistake would never be forgotten, but who, nevertheless, watched something new sprout in the place where before there was only solitude. Over the years, the city of Enoch became a pulsating place, full of sounds, conversations, and new skills. Cain's descendants brought with them a special talent, a creativity that seemed to flourish despite the shadows that shrouded their founder's past. His children and grandchildren became musicians, artisans, and blacksmiths. Each of them discovered something that could add to that small civilization, a way to make Enoch a place unlike any other. Tubal-Cain, one of his descendants, was the first to work with metals, creating tools and weapons that would transform forever life in the city. Jabal, another of his heirs, began teaching techniques for creating tents, expanding the space to house more families. And Jubal, Tubal-Cain's brother, brought music, making instruments that filled the streets with previously unimaginable sounds, like a kind of voice of the city. Cain observed these transformations with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He knew that somehow his hands had paved the way for all of this, but at the same time he continued to feel distant, as if he were just a shadow watching life unfold around him. In each new talent, in each innovation, he saw the reflection of something he had been searching for a long time, but knew he would never fully achieve. Time passed, and Cain, aged and marked by life, continued his walk through the streets of Enoch, the city he himself created. He was a lonely figure, almost a ghost in the eyes of the inhabitants. His descendants saw in him a distant, almost mythical presence, the founder who rarely mixed, but whose observant gaze always seemed attentive to what was being built there. The city thrived, full of sounds and voices and work, but Cain remained restless, as if his soul had never found the rest it sought. As he looked at everything around him, Cain felt a strange mixture of pride and regret. He'd created a place where lives grew and grew, intertwined, where ideas were born and talent flourished, but his mark was still there, as deep as on the first day. He knew that his story, his mistake, would never leave him. Even with the city around him, he remained in exile. And so Cain followed his path through the boundaries of Enoch, almost like an invisible guardian, a figure who, as time passed, seemed more legend than man. His footsteps, silent and distant, echoed through the city streets, reminding everyone that the first man to stray had also been the first to build. He was a living reminder of how bad choices leave eternal marks, but also of how, even among the ruins of our own mistakes, something new can be born. And so Cain's life became a distant memory, his figure a shadow that faded among the generations that flourished in Enoch. But his story, marked by choices and consequences, was engraved not only on the land he cursed with his act, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who came after. He, who had been the first to be lost, was also the first to struggle to find some meaning in the midst of exile. Cain reminds us that a single choice can change the course of an entire life, and that the price of a thoughtless action can be carried for generations. But behind the weight of his mistake, there is something that cannot be ignored. Even in the darkness of his guilt, Cain left something behind, something that in a way redeemed his existence. In every brick of Enoch, there was an attempt to start over, a struggle to find meaning. His story teaches us that, although we cannot erase the past, there is always the opportunity to try to rebuild from mistakes, to use one's burden as a foundation for something new. Cain lived with the mark of his error, but also with the mark of someone who, despite everything, tried to find his place in the world. It's a reminder that we all carry choices and their consequences, but that if we're willing to build through the rubble, perhaps we can transform even the darkest parts of our history into something worth leaving as a legacy. In his exile and in his search for redemption, he shows us that even though we are lost, there is always a chance to create something new. If you liked Cain's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.